Hi, church family. It's Friday again, and I'm so happy that I get to share another message with you. And so this week we're going to be talking about David, and he kind of follows along with our quarantine theme here. Post-Goliath, pre-King David days, he spent a lot of time sort of self-isolating. I know he had his army with him, but they were all self-isolating in a lifestyle of fleeing Saul. And so they lived in caves. They lived at churches and places and in small areas, and they were basically hiding all over the place. And so it kind of ties in again with our concept of self-quarantining here. And so I just kind of want to go over the story of David. But I think David's life, again, pre-King days, really is very fascinating and connects really well with maybe some of the struggles that we're all going through. So I just want to take a quick look at David's life path prior to him becoming king, and things that had happened to David early on in his life. He had some huge life events, and it would seem that he shouldn't be leading that those events should have immediate rewards or immediate changes in his life, but it really doesn't. So first, like David as a young boy, he's anointed by Samuel, and that's a pretty big deal, and yet it leads to nothing. It leads to no changes. He still stays at home with his dad. He still tends to his flock. And so even after being anointed, God's anointed one, nothing changes in his life. So then David goes and he kills Goliath, the great warrior of the Philistines. He saves the Jews. He saves Israel. And yet this doesn't really lead to much other than Saul's development of jealousy. He becomes the son-in-law of Saul. He is best friends to Saul's son. And you would think that being a part of the family might change things and change his life for the better. And yet he's constantly battling still with Saul's jealousy more and more. And he's worried for his life because he's heard from his best friend that basically Saul wants to kill him. So David goes out and he wins battles. He wins the respect of his army, and he is revered within the nation, and yet this should bring great things and great glory for him, and yet he's forced to flee for his very life and leave everything that he has behind. So David's not living the life for somebody with this kind of great resume, and it's just really interesting. And to go even further, David has been doing the right thing. He saved Saul's life twice. He has two different opportunities in which he can kill Saul and supposedly, in a way take his place on the throne because he's the anointed one. And he saves his life twice, and yet even after the second time of saving Saul's life, he returns back to his life of quarantine because he's again afraid, still afraid. And so what brings David to be able to do this? And it's really David's trust that God is in control. And this allows him to continue on the path of righteousness and not making mistakes and not doing things rashly. In 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 10, we get a little glimpse of David's heart here. He says, this is right after he saves Saul's life a second time. And he says, "As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike him," Saul. "Either his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and the water jug that are near his head, and let's go." So you can see here that that David is just being patient. His life could totally be easier, in a sense, if he would have just killed Saul. Saul is the source of all of his problems. Saul is the source of the fact that he's in this quarantine life. And why not kill him, right? But easier here is just such a short-term concept, right? And David can see past the fact that maybe immediately it's good, but for long-term, not so good, because this isn't God's plan. This isn't what God has called David to do. David sees that this is not his plan, because if it was God's plan, Saul would be dead. And also, David wasn't in this just for himself. David is facing inconveniences. He's facing difficulties right and left. And yet he's willing to do this for the greater good. He's doing it for the greater good of his soldiers, the ones that have been faithful to him. He's doing it for the greater good of his country. He's doing it for the greater good of the people, like God's people. And he's doing it for the greater good, even for God, right? He understands this long-term concept that right now it's difficult. Right now it's tough. Right now this isn't the way I would do it, but for some reason this is the way that God's doing it, and I can trust in that. So then I kind of want to contrast that to a different story, a New Testament story, and we're going to turn now to Luke chapter 12. This story is actually found in different Gospels. It's found in Matthew as well, but it's the parable of the rich fool, and I'm just going to read 16 through 21. Again, that's Luke 12, 16 through 21. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God." First off, I want us to notice in this story that this man is already rich. He's a rich fool. He's a rich before we even start any of this craziness, right? And so, that's kind of interesting because this rich man is looking to acquire more. And then secondly, did you notice how often, as I was reading this, I tried to put emphasis on it, but he went through the words he, himself, I, myself. I count at least 10 times in this very short passage where he's referencing to himself and for his greater good. And then third, I want us to look at what God was concerned about, right? What is God's response to this? He's not concerned about the fact that this man has created a surplus. He's not concerned about the fact that this man is choosing to obtain more. What God says here is, who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And then verse 21, he continues, then this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. So I just want us to think about that as we're looking and reflecting on what we're going through right now. So are these times tough? Yes, absolutely. It's weird. Things are different. Is it easy to become impatient? Absolutely. We've been doing stay in place. We haven't been able to go to church. We haven't been able to hang out with our families. We haven't been able to hang out with our friends. We can't go to the movies to get away from some of this. Is it easy to become impatient? Absolutely. Is it uncomfortable to have our lives turned upside down in this way? Is it uncomfortable to wear face masks? Is it uncomfortable to constantly be thinking about, am I going to get contaminated? Am I going to contract this? What will happen? Is it easy to get uncomfortable and get anxiety over all this? Absolutely. But I challenge you to think about this. Are you finding yourself getting upset about losing the things that you were simply preparing for yourself? Or can we find strength through what David did in his story? If David was simply storing up accomplishments for himself instead of trusting God's plan, I think David's story would have been worlds different. David is constantly known as being the man with a heart after God, right? The heart of God and his faithfulness. And it's not displayed any more than during this time of his self-quarantine. David, with what must have seemed like the odds constantly stacked up against him. He's constantly getting hit left and right with new challenges and new frustrations. And he even had this great knowledge that he was the anointed one. Can you imagine knowing that you are the anointed one and still having to face these challenges? That's crazy, right? And yet, knowing all this, David chooses over and over and over again to be patient and to be trusting in God and to not worry. So I challenge you now, in these trying times, to choose to be rich towards God. And what did David do when he had nothing in the caves? He chose to be rich towards God by simply sharing his faith and his faithfulness to God to all of the men that were around him through his actions of faithfulness, through not killing Saul, through expressing to them, this isn't God's plan. If it was God's plan, he would have done something about it. I'm going to remain faithful. So even when David had nothing, he still had something that he could be rich towards God, and that was his faithfulness. But I also want to tell you, I want to encourage you that if you're struggling and if you're feeling like you're in a cave and you're taking hit after hit with this whole situation, I want to first let you know that here, this community, we are 100% wanting to help you. We are wanting to share whatever we can, whatever resources we have, whatever time we have, just to be able to come together as a community, even though it's not the way that maybe you really would like, but we can get through this. If you're struggling, don't struggle alone. I know that we can't be together in person, but we can help. We can do things, right? And I don't want you to struggle silently. I know we've been talking about David and his stoicism and how great he is, but read the Psalms. David struggles with this. A lot of the Psalms come directly from this time of David's struggle. He's angry, he's frustrated, and he vents that. And so I encourage you also to vent that, right? But also don't lose your sense of faithfulness as you're doing that. Second, I want to share with you a lyric I heard this week, and it's, "Life is not a snapshot." I hope that's encouraging, right? What we're seeing right now is just a snapshot of what we're going through. David didn't look at his life as a picture of a snapshot, right? He saw his life as a long-term thing, as a constantly moving thing, as God's plan. So don't get caught up in the fact that this snapshot of your life is frustrating. Continue to push forward and have faithfulness that there is a future, that there is something ahead tomorrow, that God has it planned. So I hope for you that you can find faithfulness this weekend as we go into the weekend, that you can just find hope and faithfulness, and that you can just be encouraged to know that through faithfulness, God will get us through this. And my song recommendations for this week are "Times" by 10th Avenue North. Just such a relevant song for what we're going through right now. And then I also recommend a classic hymn, "Trust and Obey." If you're looking for a great cover of that hymn, I totally recommend Chelsea Moon and the Franz brothers. It stays true to the hymn concept, but also brings a little bit of a fun aspect to it. So I'll have those posted at the bottom, and I really look forward to seeing you again next week. All right, you guys be blessed.